Hello and welcome everybody to According to Andrew number 108, a review of Metternich, Strategist and Visionary. I just finished this book 20 minutes ago, and it is a long one, but it's really good, and I both recommend it and don't recommend it. It's kind of one of those weird things, so I kind of want to discuss it and lessons I learned from it and all that stuff. My normal review process, which is all-encompassing and over the top. So we're going to start with the review of the book. It's excellent. It covers everything. It goes through Metternich's early life as a. So it basically covers the full gambit, right? It covers him from being a young kid to being a. It actually starts before he's a kid, because one thing that's really cool about this book is it talks about like the dynastic vision of his family, and so that's something you don't get a lot, and it's something that kind of has forced me to start thinking about those aspects a lot more. There's the legacy that you want to leave for yourself, but then there's like, okay, can you set yourself up and your family for a continued legacy? So the first whole chapter is not about Metternich himself, but it's about the family line of Metternich and what the steps they took to kind of climb over generations that corporate ladder, or not corporate, but aristocratic ladder, and go from normal everyday, or like just kind of petty nobles, into being princes of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And well, actually, it was the Holy Roman Empire at the time, and kind of all that was going on and all the craziness. So it goes through that, then it goes through his early life and all the craziness that's going around with the French Revolution, and then it goes through the conflict, as you can see on the screen there, with him and Napoleon, and how they butted heads, and how there was kind of this back and forth between them, and they were rivals in a sense, but they both admired each other because they were both men of high caliber, right? But Napoleon could they came from different worlds, right? One was from an aristocratic world where Metternich saw Napoleon as this usurper, and Napoleon saw this old feudalistic society as anachronistic and needing to crumble and stuff like that, and kind of the war between those ideas, and we're kind of still living with some of the consequences of that today, with the ideas that were pushed forward in Napoleonic and the French revolutions of equality and freedom and stuff like that. A lot of that, some of that goes back to the American Revolution, and some of it's the French Revolution. I actually listened to at Freedom Fest. There was a good presentation about how the French Revolution's foundations were more in the Romantic period, and despite claiming rationality, were more emotionally based, whereas the Americans were more rationally based, and that's why you have such two different constitutions and people that come out of it. I definitely agree with that to an extent, but I also think it has a lot to do with the people, and the Constitution is its people kind of thing, and how that develops. And that was an interesting point. There's another book I read called Bismarck. I was going to do a review on it, but I didn't get a lot out of it, so I didn't. But one thing that was noted in that book that was very interesting was how people in Europe understand, Americans understand a constitution as something that is given down from on high. It's something that's written by the elites in our time, our founding fathers, and kind of this is what defines what is to be an American kind of thing. Whereas if you compare that to the English Constitution, which is what basically and everyone in Europe kind of looked up to as the premier constitution, it was something that was formed over generations and took a long time, and it was basically it was written in, it was the things that were written in paper of how the people were. So it was, English society valued hard work and freedom, and capitalist ventures and things like that, and so that there was a very different constitution there. They also had the advantage of being an island nation, so they could get away with some of these more radical ideas during these time periods. Whereas when geopolitics is an existential threat for you, that's not something that you're really allowed to do, and that's why you see such a variance between continental powers, powers that are land-based versus maritime powers, basically island nations, because the Navy allows them to secure their borders in a way that you just simply can't in a continental system. So that's kind of the first half. And the reason I actually was reading this book was actually more for the second half, because Metternich's in this interesting time period, in this transition, that we're kind of living. He was in an epochal moment, which we are kind of living through ourselves right now, but in a different sense. So his thing was basically French rose up. There's a lot of constitutionalism that was flowing throughout the continent, and then along with that was this idea of nationalism. And people always had their national identities, but in the feudal system, because things were a lot more decentralized and fractionalized, it didn't matter as much who was the ruling party at kind of the top of the pyramid, because the things that happened at the top of the pyramid didn't affect you as much, and you were much more. It was a much more localized system. It was much more. Feudalism is very close to federalism in that regard. So it didn't matter as much, and so you kind of see this shift. And so Metternich's this interesting person because he straddles both this line of I am of the nationalist persuasion. I believe in nationalism, but he was kind of against that, and kind of the steps he took to dissuade that and keep things under lock and key, not lock and key, but basically hold the Austrian Empire together, because if he allowed nationalism to flourish, he would basically would be the end of Austria as we know it, and they had already lost the Holy Roman Empire through Napoleon's exploits and all that stuff. So, but before we go on too long, this is a really interesting quote that I thought that one of his mentors gave him, that I thought was very exemplary of how Metternich lived his life, and is something that I think is something to inspire to yourself. His mentor in this name is Vaught. Nicholas Vaught is his full name. He told him, "Your intellect and your heart are on the right road. Persevere therein. So in practical life, the lessons of history will guide you. Your career, however long it may be, will not enable you to see the end of the conflagration which is destroying the great neighboring kingdom. If you do not wish to expose yourself to reproaches, never leave the straight path. You will see many so-called great men pass you by with their swift strides. Let them pass, but do not deviate from your path. You will not catch up with them, and be it only your path, and theirs will cross when they retreat." And I think this is so emblematic of kind of the time that we live in, because there's so many people, and it can be very distracting and disheartening when you see those who aren't as good as you, or are obviously incompetent, or things like that. Basically, the cream doesn't rise to the top. It's people who kiss ass and are basically don't make a fuss, or don't make a stir. They're the ones that get promoted, or people who are willing to basically sell their soul to the devil are the ones who get promoted. And so it can be disheartening to kind of keep pushing forward. But that was something, whether or not I disagreed with kind of the visionary aspect of Metternich or not, it seemed that he had a very strong moral guidepost, and always kind of considered morality first. In that regard, I can kind of see him as a kindred spirit in a sense, and a good example of how to, if you were going to have a political career, how to lead a good and strong political career. Is that going to get you very far in the current political environment? Probably not. But we're living through a time of turmoil and stuff like that, and so there is a possibility that someone with the constitution of someone like a Metternich could rise to the top, and always use morality as a guiding voice. And by no means was he a perfect person. He was known as a womanizer, and certainly was to a certain extent, but he also suffered a lot of real hardship, and that's something that kind of pushed forward. So they talk about his family life and stuff like that, and yeah, they go into the mistresses and stuff like that he had, but he also had 3 wives and 12 children, and he outlived all 3 of those wives didn't divorce any of them. They all passed due to unexpected circumstances, which was very heartbreaking. The longest one lived to 49 at the most, and he lived to 70 or 80. Um, 75 to 80. So he outlived all of his wives. Of his children, only he had 12. Only 4 of them, I think, made it to adulthood, made it to their 50s or 60s or something like that. I think only like 2 or 3 ended up making it to living to 60, 70 years old. Uh, a lot of his kids, many of his kids died when they were very young. It was pretty common for that time period. But on top of that, you had a lot of kids that would die when they're like, he had a daughter that he lost when she was 16. He had a son that he lost when he was about 30. And a lot of this was just due to disease. In fact, I think all of them were due to disease. There wasn't any like assassinations, or none of them were in like a military campaign and got killed that way. And so that's an amount of loss that I think a lot of us are going to have a hard time kind of relating to and comprehending. I don't even have like a wife and family currently, so it's something that you can kind of sympathize with, but have a hard time relating with. But I have a feeling that due to certain jabba jabba things and stuff like that, that is something that is going to be experienced by a lot more people. And if that is something that is in your future, to kind of, maybe this is a way to kind of reflect and remember other people had really hard times and were kind of given a tough road in their path, and they pushed forward. They were able to still build a family and through the hard times, and so you can too. And Metternich lived in a very tumultuous time, like we do right now, and he still managed to build a family. His family got dispossessed of all their possessions like 3 or 4 times within his lifetime. He was basically exiled like 4 or 5 times, and he still managed to kind of do what he was able to, and pull himself together, pull his family's finances together, and build up his family, and still serve the state in a high capacity, which is very impressive, and something to be admired. So I think that covers everything in terms of the text. Like I said, it goes through the whole thing. The most interesting part for me personally was a lot of the stuff that dealt with German nationalism, and kind of how that caused a fraction within the Austrian psyche, because there was a good chunk of Austria that was Germans. They wanted to join with this greater German idea, but then there's a lot of factions within Austria that weren't. You had the Bohemians, you had the Hungarians, you had the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Croatians, the Italians were in there. I'm sure there's a bunch of other ones that I'm not even. Serbs are probably in there. Some other ones that I'm forgetting. And so that caused a real conundrum within the society yourself, and you can kind of see that in America today as well. So that's something to consider. So I think this is a really great book. The thing is, it is 750 pages, and it is excellently written. It's a long read. It's a good read. It's a biography. To a certain extent, it's going to be dense. There's no real getting around that. But Wolfram Simon, who wrote this book, wrote it absolutely excellently. And so if you are interested in anything that has to do with Metternich, or that time period, I think this is a great book to read. If you don't necessarily have a reason to read this book, I don't think there's necessarily a reason to read it. So that's kind of the, like, some of the other books, I'm like, oh, here's all the lessons you can pull from, like Discourses by Machiavelli. I think there's so much in there that it's like worth reading regardless, right? This one's kind of not as much. Like, if you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend it. If it's not something that really particularly interests you, then yeah, probably give this a pass. But if you're ever interested in that kind of time period, this might be a good, and you like having kind of individual perspectives on the whole thing, this might be the book to kind of go to. Now for the various notes that I took on the whole thing. Well, 1 second. So, oi, all right, sorry about that. Hopefully I didn't blow your ears out. So Metternich is this interesting person because he's kind of like a Kissinger. Let me see if I can find my thing that I wrote on that. Gosh dang. Okay. Metternich was the Kissinger of his day. While his initial policies worked for the crisis at hand, it set up another crisis in which the revolutions of 1948 1949 were fueled by nationalism and liberal sentiment. But what I mean by that is basically what was known as the Metternich system was the Congress of Vienna that was set up after the Napoleonic era. Basically, they had ousted Napoleon, and all the great powers kind of came together, and it's like, okay, how are we going to divvy up this new borders need to be redrawn. How are we going to kind of divvy this up so it's fair? How are we going to make sure that the last 20 years of war doesn't just continue indefinitely and ruin us all? And there's a lot of people at this time that had just come off the 30 Years' War, and that was just basically a never-ending conflict that ground all of the economies and societies within it to poverty and destitution, because there was just there was just constant war. So it destroyed all the countryside and destroyed all the towns and killed lots of people and all this stuff. And so there's various people, like older parts of the generation, could kind of see that coming with the Napoleonic Wars. And so there was some of this that kind of bled into the thinkings and the attitudes and the perceptions of the Metternich system. Well, actually, the 30 Years' War was the 1600s, wasn't it? All right, that might not be accurate, but that was the closest thing in approximation to this, right? So you basically have the 30 Years' War that bleeds into the thinkings of the Napoleonic era, which then bleeds into the thinkings of World War I, right? These are like kind of three big conflicts that are spread out by about a century from each other. And so there's a lot that's changed in that time period. But there's but the in-between time, there was a lot of work that was done so that said event couldn't happen again, except history is cyclic, so eventually that was going to kind of come back and end up in conflict again. So yeah, so that's kind of where we're at, and that ended up setting up the issues that developed in 1848, 1849 with the nationalist uprisings and the liberal sentiments, on top of liberal ideologies getting spread throughout all of Europe because Napoleon's armies marched across all of Europe, and people talked to each other. This is mainly driven by the debts accrued during the Napoleonic Wars. This set off a downward trend in the Turchin kaleidodynamics model, while the prize shrinks, so the elite for the elite to maintain their standard of living, they have to squeeze the lower classes, along with competition to get into those elite circles, because basically the lower classes have no way of surviving themselves, so their only real option is to try to get into the elite. So the competition for that shrinking pie increases, on top of the elites themselves having more, like, as time goes on, having more children, so therefore the elite group grows. And the positions, therefore, if they stay the same, then there's more competition for the same positions, or if they shrink, then it's also an issue. The post-Napoleonic era is similar to today, as they had major inflation issues due to the devastation caused by the war and the shrunken workforce due to so many men dying in the wars, which is another interesting observation that I had. Then Metternich had this very interesting point, and it's something that I've wrestled with quite a bit myself, which is theoretically there are only nation states, but practically there's almost exclusively multinational states. Metternich. While this is true, so the issue that you kind of always run into is, at what point do you stop subdividing, and at what point do you say, okay, this is what constitutes a nation? And so, like, the nation, it's basically the shorthand is it's the farthest extent of the family. It's a peoples that is defined by tradition, culture, blood. What are the other things? religion and gosh, I need to write these down. Your bloodline, your tradition, your culture, your religion, and something else. Anyway, while it is true that the nation, so while I find this true, I still think that the nation should be run by those which the nation state represents. While it's unfortunate for those who have no nation state, and while hopefully they can establish one at some point, they should in no way be allowed power within the system. They should be afforded protections if they have no other home, so as to not be trampled by the nation in which they are a guest, and thus they should be treated as such. It is an imperfect system, but we live in an imperfect world, and I believe skewing things in favor of the nation is better than the alternative offered by empire. So my thoughts on that. On page 567, second paragraph of the new section, it discusses how the national spirit of Germany was fostered by the student body, which is kind of interesting. This is due to them having connections and networks across Germany, as the various German Confederation universities were open to all of them, thus being the point on which the national spirit grew out of. It almost seems like an inversion, though, as nationalism at this time was an internationalist movement, because all of these different, so the students saw themselves as German, but everyone else in Württemberg and Saxony and Prussia and what are some of the other ones? Bavaria, all of them saw themselves as, Bavarian or from Württemberg or Prussian or Saxon. And so it's through these student movements that all this stuff happens. And I find it interesting that you always seem, in a lot of revolutionary things, especially liberal ones, it's always the student body that pushes this stuff. It was a body politic. It was moving the body politic to a greater centralization. This differs from the current nationalist movement, which seeks to decentralize and restore national sovereignty. The question that arises is how restoring national sovereignty should go. This ties into Metternich's thought on the manner in which states that can find a way to divide a peoples further, and so they have a reasonable sized body politic. It would inherently have to be an empire in some capacity. That is kind of his perspective. That since you will always have a composite of people, the nation state is a misnomer, and you will always, in technicality, have an empire. Which, if you look at how the various nationalities are scattered throughout Europe, does kind of make sense to a certain extent. And if you look at how nationalities are scattered throughout America, that is also probably going to be the case if America breaks up. So maybe things won't be as hardline as I had maybe perceived them to be, but we'll see. It is interesting that revolutions always start with the students, seemingly. When I say this started, I mean that they're the foot soldiers of the revolution that go and act and get things rolling, and they are the interface between the thought leaders of the revolution and the revolution as a general movement. They translate the ideology from the abstract to tangibles for everyday people. They disseminate the teachings of the revolution till it enters the zeitgeist. Their actions are the core backbone of how revolutions happen. The Russian Communist revolution was started by students. China, they had a big influence. France and America, I am less sure about. Apparently, Germany's unification was kickstarted by this group. Also, revolutionary ideas from critical race theory to the trans right movement were leveraged through the university system. So this makes sense, as universities are where the elite and elite aspirants are to be found. Thus, if the revolution is a fight between multiple elite factions, the most likely place to find disgruntled elites are those young ones who see their ambitions blocked on all sides by the current system. This leaves them to the conclusion that toppling the current regime is the way to get a shot at fulfilling their ambitions at all, and so the risk to reward balance is in favor of revolution. Also, something interesting that I discovered from this book is book burnings were apparently a tradition in Germany for a long time. As Germans attempted to unify, it destroyed literature whose literature of those who were its enemy. Among those was a Jewish guy named Saul Osher, who preached tolerance, cosmopolitan, and universal education. What does that sound like? It's the same crap that's being preached right now, and it's the thing that is undermining America. Um, so, as you can see, this kind of idea of tolerance has always been pushed by those who look to subvert and push um, degenerative behavior within a society. Tolerance is not a virtue. Uh, so he was against the fraternal. This Saul guy was against the fraternal organizations that uh, formed communal bonds with the nation and called the celebration of German identity anti-Judaic. Uh, so, as you can see, it's the same playbook that we kind of see a lot out of. You can see the same play, like whenever someone brings up something against Israel or anyone that is potentially Jewish, they just say anti-Semitism. At, what was it, 1840? Like, nothing's changed. And it's over 100 years. So, almost 200 years. So, as you can see, since nothing changes, don't worry about that kind of stuff. And that just crashed. So, hopefully, we can kind of keep going. Fraternities were formed and founded at a time of turmoil in Europe and used as networks that enabled the social change required to form Germany into a singular nation. This is why these meeting places, like the Red Pill communities or other communities, are a threat, and why fraternities were converged in the American universities in America, because when you do that kind of stuff, it it's a way to consolidate power and control within the system. And so that's why we kind of see a demonization of these outside groups, because those were the groups that helped kickstart and run the current system in America, or is it America? In Germany and in a lot of these other places. So Metternich straddles this weird line where he represents both the current order and maintains the status quo. Thus, he serves as a guide for maintaining power, but he's kind of in an interesting position because currently within our system, people like myself and are not happy with the current system, and so they're looking to switch out the system for a new system, and it kind of runs into this issue. One issue that I should clarify that I kind of, so Metternich is the representation of who we currently have in power, the Nancy Pelosi's, the Bidens, and all that stuff. And I think he was a really good statesman. I think, well, as I had said, Metternich is a good example of like a Henry Kissinger and stuff like that. And he was kind of like the last great statesman. And so what we get into later throughout Metternich is when he's basically forced to retire, you have kind of these people who are interested in their own gain and not clearly as good as at the game of politics kind of take over, and that's when you see the decline of Austria. And so you're seeing similarly, you don't have, whether or not you agree with how Kissinger handled things, he was a good politician and good geopolitical strategist. And when you don't have someone like that in there, you're seeing the decline of America. You're also seeing the decline of Austria. There's certain outside forces that even someone who's brilliant might not be able to right the ship on, but those are the kind of issues that we're dealing with right now, and so it kind of puts you in an interesting paradigm. Let's see. One of the mistakes Metternich makes is that he attempts to bottle up the problem of nationalism, which is what it boils over in 1848, 1849, and one of the things that kind of forces him out of power. Is the same issue that the current ruling classes in America have now. But organic movements can't be bottled up, and they can only be redirected by trying to squash the movement. Inherently creates more dogmatic adherence to it and increases its anti-fragility. So a good example of a redirect would be like the progressive movement. Oh, here we go. The populist movement was successfully worn down by the establishment of creating internal factions and competing objectives that cause victories to fail to materialize. So it can be done, but even so, the movement popped up again as a progressive movement, but this time it was established. The establishment was ready for it and was successfully used it and redirected it. And so that's when people like Cargill and Rockefeller and stuff like that were able to come to prominence and took over as kind of the new elites as industrialization took over in America, and though that elite faction came to prominence within the American society. And you see kind of a similar thing in Metternich. Sort of, it manifests itself more in factionalism within Austria. This is an interesting quote from Metternich that I thought. Metternich knew no conspirators who are miserable, and there are no conspirators who are as miserable and superficial as professors, individually as well as taken as a group. They are men of theory and put forward propositions, but revolution was not a theoretical pursuit. And so this is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where professors never are people of action, and that's why they propagandize and basically create soldiers for the revolution via the student movement, and they never actually do anything, and then they send people out to take over. There was a great quote. I forgot who said it, but it was someone who was an elite within the circles, and they had this war in the palaces, peace in the shacks. This is a great example of the ruling class disconnect with the greater society. What is this peace that you speak of? When general war is called and these people of the shacks are called on to die in the thousands, is there ever any concern for these people? At least the violent actions against... this was in response to an assassination that happened to someone of the ruling class. At least these violent actions against the ruling class are directed at a people whose actions warrant this type of consequence due to holding the reins of power. If the ruling classes are removed from violent consequences for their actions, then they become unaccountable and corrupt, which, considering that this was the Bourbon monarchy, oh, that's right, I can almost guarantee that this is the case. The French Revolution, Napoleon, happened for a reason, and it was mainly predicated on the poor monarchical management and the insulation from the consequences of those decisions. So that kind of covers that part, and then let's see what else I had for notes. I have a lot of notes. Oh, is that everything? Oh, no, hold up. Okay, here we go. So Metternich was kind of against... So they also played out at the towards the end of the book this power game that happened between Metternich and Colwart, and Colwart was using all the underhanded tactics, smearing him, doing everything that he could to get him out of power, and eventually it was successful in securing his power initially and then being able to force Metternich out of power in the end. But it's interesting that Metternich was resistant to using underhanded tactics to dominate the political arena via slander and the like, but was fine with using censorship and secret police when it came to controlling the general population. So it's kind of I guess it's different when you're dealing with people of your class. It also could be an instance where not all speech is good kind of thing, and he believed that slander and stuff like that was the thing that undermined rule of law, like Machiavelli believed and showed in how Rome conducted their business. But yeah, it's interesting that Prussian used free trade as a means to combine dispersed German states into Germany, which is also something they're attempting to do again in the EU. The shift from feudal system to a state system was effectively changing from a private property residence to a public one. So this was an issue that Metternich ran into when dealing with the Austrian monarch, is he wanted to kind of shift the monarchy into a state-run thing, but that's basically having the monarch give up possession of all of his lands and turning all of that land basically to public property. And it's kind of a weird transition, right? Like, when you see the state and basically all the territory within it as your own private property, that is a kind of fundamental shift within your head that I can imagine being kind of hard to want to give that kind of ownership up to a certain extent. He wanted to do that to help clean up the running and administration of the state, but this was just kind of something that the crown was never going to give up, and so it kind of created this friction between him and the royals, and was one of the things that ended up having him fall from power at towards the end of his life. So that was kind of interesting. Metternich had an interesting comment on American democracy that I think is very telling of the times. I do not know where it will end, nor how it will end, but it cannot end in a quiet, ripe old age. So, we're at year 250-ish of our life as a country in terms of the United States of America, and things are not looking so good. So, yeah, we'll see. Then later on, Metternich ended up getting prosecuted and brought up on basically false tax charges after he was thrown out of power by those within the crown. So it was interesting to see. Let's see if I have a note on that. Yeah, okay, we'll get back to that. And it had a lot of the same ringings as to what happened to Trump with the special prosecution when he's in power. A lot of the stuff that they're doing to him now that he's out of power. And it's a slow, drawn-out process that is intended to smear one's character simply through being conducted. The implication being that if they were clean, this commission wouldn't be needed. The proceedings are drawn out long enough so that the smear campaign can at least last as long as possible and allow people to forget the original reason for starting the commission in the first place. That way, when the results come out, they are far off the mark of the original goal of the commission, no one remembers, and people just move on with their lives as the damage is done and it cannot be reversed. This is why Machiavelli was so hardcore against the type of slander which within a society, as it allows the least moral, or as he puts it, with the least amount of virtue to rise to the top. And then Metternich has an interesting. Metternich was always a big fan of England, and he has this quote where he's like, if I could choose which country I was from, I believe I would choose to be an Englishman. So England, the freest country in the world, because of the most orderly. Metternich clearly understood freedom in the old Christian sense of self-restraint from vice, and not from the Luciferian sense of do as thou wilt, which was currently sweeping the continent in 1848. That was the foundations of the French Revolution and the like. He also understood that the foundation of the English aristocracy does not lie in this concept of nobility, but in the concept of property. This constitutes an equality which is useful through its successes, one that elevates rather than degrades, as the equality of misery does. And here you can kind of see Metternich articulating kind of the deviation between a capitalist versus communist ideology to a certain extent, an egalitarian versus a hierarchical society. Here again, Metternich shows the difference in the intellectual roots of these concepts as they are understood in England versus in the continent. This is basically the description of the difference between capitalism and communism before these ideas were fully formed. Additionally, this is the foundational roots of American nobility as well, which is why property has played such a predominant role within American society and the psyche for so long, and will continue to do so for as far as I can tell. If we add to our understanding of our understanding of kaleidodynamics, which is the cycle of history, and understand that the elite class is becoming overcrowded as more of the lower class rush to try to make it to the elite status through the purchase of homes, because that's one of the ways that you basically get into being considered part of the upper class, and college degrees, which is effectively just titles of nobility. That is the driving force behind these spikes in price of the on top of the economic factors. So prices of homes are going up by a crazy amount, and college tuition is going up by a crazy amount, and there's economic factors driving that, but there's also this drive to try to get into the political aristocracy within our society, because as someone not in the aristocracy, in the commoner class, the opportunities to be successful are being squeezed. At least that's the perception. In fact, it could be seen as the economic factors being used to intentionally try to edge out more people of the aristocratic class. So as prices of homes go up, you have less competition to get into the aristocracy, and as the price of college tuition goes up, you also have less people that can afford it, so there's less pressure on the aristocracy. So those are kind of two aspects. The political battle between Metternich and Karl shows why empires do not work. Austria, as a great power, started a decline because of the obstructionist policies of Karl. These obstructionist policies, some of which I agree with, namely that he was anti-free trade, were based on how it benefited Bohemia above all else, which was one of the smaller states within the Austrian Empire. One of the sub-states, I should say, not smaller. And many times came at the expense of Austria's position as a great power and its influence within Greater Germany. This makes sense because to join within the other German states into a Greater Germany would have diminished the power and influence of Bohemia, which is not German. The national sectarianism always happens within an empire and can be seen in America today with the election of the people like Ilhan Omar. Tribe trumps ideology always. Metternich and Bismarck's views on geopolitics is inherently non-globalist, something I wanted to kind of point out. While they created systems of communication between various powers of Europe, this is and always will be a necessary function of foreign minister. For without these, the lines of communications wars will break out, and while war sometimes is necessary, it is generally to be avoided. Where they differ is that they did not, through this system, look to create superstructures on top of these communication lines in which the various powers would then be subordinated. Those are what the globalists attempt to do with systems like NATO, the UN, and the IMF. Supranational organizations that are not accountable to anyone but those pulling the strings. At least that's how the globalists would like it to be, but that level of centralization is not possible. And lastly, I wanted to kind of leave off with something from the book as a way to kind of wrap this whole thing up. So as you're reading the book, and especially in the last kind of couple pages, it really does feel like you've left an era behind, right? It started with all the turmoil and stuff like that of the Napoleonic era and all the craziness that's happening with the revolutions of 1848 and stuff like that. And finally, as Metternich's life's starting to wind down, it feels like, that was the old way, and we're kind of coming into a new, as Metternich's passing off from this world and stuff like that. There's new people, there's new systems. Bismarck's gonna be the big next name that's dominates the continent, and you have these new people that are kind of coming in and taking up the reins. And the era of Napoleon is behind us, and the 19th century is ahead of us, or the 20th century is ahead of us, and World War I and all that stuff, and a lot of the national unifications and all that stuff are kind of coming up, and it just it kind of has this emotional and psychological shift that you can kind of read in the pages, and I can't think of a book that's kind of captured that before, where it's like, you read it and you can tell this is the end of an era kind of thing, which you always kind of get that when you end a book to a certain extent, but I thought the way that this was captured in this book was really well done. So, like I said, this is Metternich, Strategist and Visionary. It's an excellent book. If you have any interest in Metternich, though I definitely recommend it. Those were kind of the ideas and things that I was able to pull from the pages and lessons that I learned from the overall book, along with what the book was about. Hopefully you guys found this interesting. I was hoping to keep this short, but I knew it was going to be a long one. So thank you guys very much. Like, share, subscribe, comment, tell me if you've read this book, what your thoughts were on it, or just kind of share your various thoughts about this whole thing. But thank you guys for stopping in, and I hope you guys had a good day. Goodbye.